Jasmine Anderson, a hardworking single mother, stares at the eviction notice on her door, her world teetering on the edge. Just when it seems like the walls are closing in, she gets a phone call that could change everything. But instead of fleeing her troubles, Jasmine has a radical plan, one that her cruel landlord could never see coming. Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Let's dive in. Jasmine Anderson wasn't unfamiliar with hardship. At just 28 years old, she had faced more challenges than many people twice her age. From an early age, she had learned to navigate life's difficulties with grace and resilience, always putting the needs of her 6-year-old son, Elijah, before her own. For the past 3 years, Jasmine had called a modest, 2-bedroom apartment home. It wasn't much, but it was hers, a sanctuary for her and Elijah amidst the chaos of working 2 jobs and managing life as a single mother. Jasmine had always been a model tenant. She paid her rent on time, never caused trouble, and kept her apartment tidy. Mr. Walters, the building's landlord, was a man in his late 50s, known for his gruff demeanor. He wasn't openly hostile, but he wasn't friendly either. Over time, Jasmine had noticed small differences in how Mr. Walters treated her compared to other tenants, though she tried to shrug them off. When her upstairs neighbor's stove broke, Mr. Walters sent a repairman the next day. When Jasmine's sink began leaking, it took 3 weeks for him to send anyone to fix it, despite her polite reminders. Still, she said nothing, not wanting to cause trouble or risk drawing unwanted attention to herself and Elijah. Life as a single mother was difficult enough without adding housing instability to the mix. Every morning, Jasmine woke up before dawn, got Elijah ready for school, and then headed to her first job at a local diner. After her morning shift ended, she'd rush to her second job as an administrative assistant at a small insurance firm. By the time she picked Elijah up from his after-school program and brought him home, she was exhausted. But no matter how tired she was, Jasmine always found time to help Elijah with his homework, cook dinner, and read him a bedtime story. It wasn't easy, but they made it work. Then, one Thursday afternoon, everything changed. Jasmine had just gotten home from work, her feet aching from standing all day, and Elijah was playing with his action figures on the living room floor. As she sifted through the day's mail, a folded piece of paper caught her eye, a notice taped to her front door. Unfolding it, her heart sank as she read the bold letters at the top of the page. 30-day eviction notice. Her hands trembled as she scanned the rest of the letter. No reason was provided, just an impersonal declaration that she had 30 days to vacate the apartment. Jasmine felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. Why now? She hadn't missed a single rent payment. There had been no complaints about her or Elijah. She had done everything right, played by the rules, and now this? Trying to calm the rising panic in her chest, Jasmine called Mr. Walters. He answered on the second ring, his voice as curt and cold as ever. "Yes," he barked into the phone. "Mr. Walters, this is Jasmine in 3B, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I just received an eviction notice, but I'm not sure why. There hasn't been any." "Your lease is up," he interrupted. "Time to move on." Jasmine blinked in confusion. "But my lease automatically renews. I've been here for 3 years, and I've never—" "I don't have to explain anything to you," Mr. Walters snapped, his tone hardening. "You've got 30 days. That's more than enough time to find somewhere else." She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could get another word out, he continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "Maybe you should find somewhere more fitting for your kind." For a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Jasmine felt the breath leave her body as the weight of his words sank in. She had suspected for years that Mr. Walters didn't care for her. But she never imagined he would say something so blatantly cruel, so filled with malice. "Your kind." The words echoed in her mind, heavy and cutting. She knew exactly what he meant, and it wasn't just about being a tenant. Tears of frustration and anger welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give Mr. Walters the satisfaction of hearing her cry. Instead, she took a deep breath and, with as much dignity as she could muster, simply said, "Thank you for your time," before hanging up the phone. For a long moment, she stood frozen in her small living room, staring at the eviction notice in her hand. How could this be happening? She had worked so hard to create a stable life for herself and Elijah. She had fought tooth and nail to keep a roof over their heads, and now, with just a few cold words and a piece of paper, it was all slipping away. "Mama? Are we going to have a new house?" Elijah's small voice cut through the silence, bringing her back to reality. He had looked up from his toys, his big brown eyes filled with innocent curiosity. Jasmine's heart clenched. How could she explain this to him? How could she tell her son that they were being forced out of their home because of someone else's prejudice? Forcing a smile, she knelt down beside Elijah and ruffled his curly hair. "We'll figure something out, baby. Don't worry." But deep down, Jasmine was worried, very worried. She didn't have the money to move, and she didn't have family nearby who could help. Every cent she made went towards rent, groceries, and Elijah's needs. Finding a new place, especially on such short notice, seemed impossible. That night, as she lay awake in bed, her mind raced with questions and fears. Where would they go? How would she find a new apartment? And even if she did, would they be treated any better there? The fear of being homeless gnawed at her, a constant presence in the back of her mind. She had worked too hard for too long to end up back at square one. But even in the darkest moments, something inside Jasmine refused to give up. She had faced adversity before, and had always found a way to push through. This situation, as unfair as it was, would be no different. She would find a way to protect her son, no matter what it took. With that thought in mind, Jasmine made a silent vow to herself. She wouldn't let Mr. Walters win. She wouldn't allow his cruelty to dictate the course of her life. Somehow, some way, she would turn this around. The storm had arrived, but Jasmine was determined to weather it, because if there was one thing she had learned in her years as a single mother, it was that she was stronger than she realized. And this storm, like all the others, would pass. The days after receiving the eviction notice felt like a blur to Jasmine. Each morning, she woke up with a weight pressing down on her chest, a constant reminder that her time in the apartment was running out. She continued going to work, continued caring for Elijah, but every free moment was consumed by worry and panic. Her mind raced with endless questions. Where would they go? How could she afford a new place on such short notice? And what if she couldn't find something before the eviction date? Jasmine knew she had to take action. She spent her lunch breaks frantically searching for apartments, scrolling through listings on her phone, calling property managers, and visiting potential rentals. But every option seemed either too expensive or too far from Elijah's school. The affordable places were in worse condition than her current apartment, and the nicer ones were beyond her budget. As the days passed, her frustration grew, and hope began to dwindle. The clock was ticking, and it seemed like the world was closing in on her. The people at work noticed the change in her demeanor. Normally upbeat and friendly, Jasmine had become quiet and withdrawn. Even her boss, a no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Conway, asked if everything was all right. Jasmine considered telling her the truth, but hesitated. She didn't want to come across as needy or pitiful. She'd always prided herself on handling things on her own. So instead, she forced a smile and said, "Just a little stressed, but I'm fine." But Jasmine wasn't fine. Each day that passed brought her closer to the dreaded eviction date. She kept replaying Mr. Walters' hateful words in her head, and the anger bubbled up inside her like a slow-burning fire. How could he just throw her and Elijah out with no warning, no real reason, other than his own prejudice? It wasn't right. And yet, it seemed there was nothing she could do to stop it. One particularly difficult night, as she sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open to yet another disappointing apartment listing, Jasmine found herself staring out of the window at the darkened street below. Elijah was asleep in the next room, his soft breathing the only sound in the quiet apartment. She felt so small, so powerless. All her life, she had done everything she could to stay on the right path, to work hard to provide for her son. But now, all of that felt like it was slipping away. She was teetering on the edge of despair. But then something unexpected happened. The next morning, as she was leaving for work, Jasmine received a phone call. The number wasn't familiar, but something told her to answer it. On the other end of the line was a calm, professional voice. "Miss Anderson, this is Thomas Marks. I'm the financial advisor for the trust your grandmother set up years ago. I've been trying to get in touch with you. We've recently reviewed the trust, and there's some important information regarding its value that I think you'll want to hear. Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. She had all but forgotten about the trust her grandmother had set up when she was a child. It wasn't much at the time, just a small amount of money her grandmother had saved up from her modest job as a seamstress. Her grandmother had passed away years ago, and Jasmine hadn't thought much about the trust since. But now, hearing the financial advisor's words, she felt a flicker of hope. Is something wrong with the trust? Jasmine asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Not at all, Mr. Marks replied. Quite the opposite, actually. Due to some fortunate investments, the trust has grown significantly over the years. I've been reviewing the account, and I'm pleased to inform you that it's now valued at a considerable amount, enough to make a substantial purchase if you choose to. Jasmine blinked in disbelief. I don't understand. How much are we talking about? There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and then Mr. Marks gave her the number. Jasmine nearly dropped her phone. It was far more than she had ever imagined, more than enough to buy a house outright or invest in a property that could secure her future. She felt a rush of emotions, shock, relief, and a deep, overwhelming gratitude for her grandmother's foresight. She had no idea the trust had grown this much. It was a lifeline, thrown to her just when she needed it most. I can't believe this, Jasmine said, her voice barely above a whisper. This changes everything. Mr. Marks chuckled softly. I imagine it does. I'll send over the necessary documents for you to review, and we can talk about your options. But rest assured, Miss Anderson, you're in a very strong financial position now. After the call ended, Jasmine sat down on the edge of her bed, her mind racing. It was as if a massive weight had been lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of control over her future. She didn't have to move into a rundown apartment or scrape together enough money to make rent. She had options now, real, tangible options. But as the initial shock began to wear off, a new thought entered Jasmine's mind. She had more than enough money to move into a new home, but something deep inside her resisted the idea. Why should she be the one forced to leave? Why should she uproot her life and her son's life just because Mr. Walters wanted to get rid of her? The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. She had been a good tenant. She had paid her rent on time, followed all the rules, and asked for nothing. She didn't deserve this. And now, with this newfound financial power, Jasmine realized she didn't have to accept it. That's when the radical idea took hold of her. What if she didn't just leave? What if, instead of finding another place, she found a way to stay, and not just stay, but own? It seemed impossible at first, the kind of thought that only entered someone's mind in a dream. But the more she considered it, the more it made sense. She began researching property ownership, using every spare moment to learn about real estate, financing, and the local market. It was a steep learning curve, but Jasmine was determined. And then she discovered something that changed everything. The very building she lived in was up for sale. It wasn't just any building. It was the building Mr. Walters owned, the same building he was trying to evict her from. The price was high, but with the money from her grandmother's trust, it was within reach. A sense of destiny settled over Jasmine. This wasn't just about keeping a roof over her head anymore. This was about taking control of her life, of her future. She wasn't going to let Mr. Walters decide her fate. She was going to buy the building, and she was going to change everything. With that thought in mind, she set the plan in motion. She contacted a real estate agent, signed the necessary paperwork, and within days, the wheels were turning. The eviction date loomed, but Jasmine was no longer afraid. She had something Mr. Walters would never see coming. She was about to become his landlord. As the days ticked closer to her eviction date, Jasmine could feel the tension building around her. But this time, it wasn't a crushing weight. It was the anticipation of a moment she had been secretly preparing for. A moment where everything would change, not just for her, but for everyone in the building. The process of buying the property had been a whirlwind. Jasmine wasn't a wealthy real estate mogul or an experienced buyer. She was a single mother with no prior knowledge of how to purchase a building. let alone manage one. But with determination and the right team of professionals behind her, her real estate agent, a lawyer, and her financial advisor, things had moved faster than she ever thought possible. The building, like many in the area, had fallen into disrepair under Mr. Walters' ownership. The tenants had long complained of neglected maintenance issues, some of which Jasmine herself had experienced firsthand. Broken appliances, drafty windows, and inconsistent plumbing were just a few of the problems that plagued the building. But what really angered Jasmine was the way Mr. Walters had ignored the tenants' concerns. He rarely responded to requests for repairs, and when he did, the work was often shoddy and temporary. Now, as the building's purchase was finalized, Jasmine felt an incredible sense of empowerment. She wasn't just buying an apartment for herself. She was taking control of an entire building that had been neglected and mistreated. And with that control came a responsibility, one that she took seriously. This was no longer just about proving Mr. Walters wrong or getting back at him for his cruelty. It was about creating a better environment for everyone who lived there. On the morning of the scheduled eviction, Jasmine woke up early. Her nerves were on edge, but not from fear. It was more like the quiet calm before a storm, the kind of nervous energy that comes before something monumental. She dressed in her best, wanting to look strong and put together for what was about to happen. Elijah, unaware of the gravity of the day, played with his toys in the living room, excited for the breakfast they would share together before school. Jasmine sat quietly, sipping her coffee, rehearsing in her mind how the conversation with Mr. Walters would go. She had dreamed of this moment for weeks, ever since the idea of buying the building first occurred to her. The thought of Mr. Walters' face when he realized what she had done made her smile. But she knew she had to remain composed. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. By mid-morning, she made her way to Mr. Walters' small, cluttered office in the basement of the building. She had never been in there before, but she imagined it would be as disorganized and neglected as the rest of the property. She knocked on the door firmly and waited, her heart pounding in her chest. A few seconds later, Mr. Walters opened the door, his expression immediately shifting to one of irritation when he saw who was standing there. "What do you want?" he snapped. Clearly in no mood for conversation, Jasmine felt a calm wash over her. She had imagined this scene over and over again in her head, but now that she was standing there, she realized how much power she held in this moment. Mr. Walters didn't know it yet, but everything was about to change. "I'm here to discuss the eviction," she said, her voice steady and confident. Mr. Walters scoffed. "There's nothing to discuss. You're out today, end of story. I already have new tenants lined up. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Jasmine smiled slightly, taking a deep breath. "I don't think you understand, Mr. Walters. I'm not leaving." Walters frowned, confusion flashing across his face. "Excuse me?" Jasmine reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, handing it to him. "This is the deed to the building," she said calmly. "As of this morning, I'm the new owner." For a moment, Mr. Walters stood there, blinking in disbelief. He opened the folder with shaky hands, his eyes scanning the documents as his face slowly paled. He read through the paperwork, flipping pages, looking for some kind of mistake, some loophole that would invalidate what he was seeing. But there was no mistake. "You bought the building?" he stammered, the words coming out in a strained whisper. Jasmine nodded, keeping her voice calm and controlled. "That's right. You tried to throw me out, but I'm not going anywhere. In fact, I'm now in charge of this building, and let's just say there are going to be some changes." Mr. Walters' face flushed red with anger, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to find the right words. But nothing came. He had clearly never anticipated that one of his tenants, especially Jasmine, would have the means or the audacity to buy the very property he owned. His control, his power over her and the other tenants, had just been stripped away in the most unexpected way. "You can't just," he started, but his voice trailed off, as if he didn't even believe what he was saying. Jasmine took a step closer, her confidence growing with every passing second. "It's already done, Mr. Walters. You're no longer the landlord here. I am. And the first thing I'm doing as the new owner is replacing you as the property manager. Effective immediately, you're relieved of your duties. Mr. Walters stood there, dumbfounded. His entire world was crumbling right in front of him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Jasmine, the woman he had looked down on, dismissed, and tried to evict, had just taken everything from him. Jasmine held his gaze for a moment longer, letting the gravity of the situation sink in for him. She wasn't angry anymore. In fact, she felt a sense of peace. She had won, not just for herself but for Elijah and for all the tenants who had suffered under Mr. Walters' neglect. This was justice. "There's a new management company coming in to take over the building," she continued. "I've already arranged for them to meet with the tenants and start addressing the repairs that you've ignored for years. The days of ignoring people's needs and treating them like they don't matter are over." Mr. Walters was silent, his face a mixture of shock and defeat. He seemed to realize there was nothing left to say, nothing he could do to reverse what had happened. The power he once wielded had been taken from him, and it had happened in the most unexpected way. Jasmine turned to leave, but before she stepped out the door, she looked back at Mr. Walters one last time. "This could have been different," she said softly. "You could have treated people with respect. You could have done the right thing, but now you'll have to live with the consequences." With that, she walked out of the office, leaving Mr. Walters standing in stunned silence. As Jasmine stepped into the hallway, she felt an overwhelming sense of relief and triumph. For so long, she had been at the mercy of someone else's decisions, but now she was in control. And with that control came the power to change things for the better. She smiled to herself, knowing that this was only the beginning. There was still so much work to be done to fix the building and make it a place where people could live without fear of being mistreated or neglected. But now, with the deed in her name and the building under her control, Jasmine knew that anything was possible. For the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. Not just for herself, but for everyone in the building. They had all been living under Mr. Walters' oppressive management for too long, and now they had a chance for something better. And Jasmine was going to make sure they got it. With the paperwork finalized and the title of the building officially transferred into her name, Jasmine wasted no time in making the changes she had envisioned. She wasn't just determined to be a good landlord. She was determined to be the kind of landlord that she and the other tenants deserved. From the moment she walked out of Mr. Walters' office, she knew she was embarking on a journey that would require both hard work and heart. But she was ready for it. The first thing she did was hire a new property management company. Jasmine wanted to work with people who understood her vision of fairness, efficiency, and care. After interviewing several candidates, she found the perfect team. A small, family-owned business that prided itself on tenant relationships and maintaining properties to the highest standard. They were as enthusiastic about her vision as she was, and they agreed to hit the ground running. The transition wasn't as simple as flipping a switch, but Jasmine had anticipated that. She took the time to meet with the new management team, walking them through the building, pointing out the long-standing issues that Mr. Walters had neglected. They were shocked to see the extent of the disrepair: leaky faucets, cracked walls, windows that wouldn't close properly, and a heating system that only worked in some parts of the building. It was no wonder the tenants had been frustrated for years. Jasmine wanted the repairs to begin immediately, but she also knew that communication with the tenants was just as important. Many of the residents had been living in the building for as long as Jasmine, some even longer, and they were understandably wary of any new changes. They had seen Mr. Walters ignore their concerns for so long that they were skeptical about whether anything would really improve. To address this, Jasmine decided to host a building-wide meeting in the courtyard. She had a flyer printed and distributed to every apartment, inviting the tenants to come meet with her and the new management team to discuss the future of the building. The response was better than she expected. On the evening of the meeting, nearly every tenant showed up, filling the courtyard with an air of curiosity and cautious optimism. Jasmine stood at the front, flanked by the new property managers. She felt a wave of nervousness wash over her as she saw the expectant faces staring back at her, people of all ages, backgrounds, and stories. She knew she had their attention, but earning their trust would take time. She took a deep breath and began. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice steady but warm. "I know things haven't been easy around here for a while, and I want you to know that I understand. I've been living in this building for 3 years, and I've experienced the same frustrations you all have. But I'm here to tell you that things are going to change, starting today." There was a murmur of surprise among the crowd. People exchanged glances, some hopeful, others skeptical. Jasmine continued, "As of this morning, I'm the new owner of this building. I know that might come as a shock to some of you, but I want you to know that I didn't make this decision lightly. I'm not here to raise your rent or push you out. I'm here because I believe we all deserve better." A hand went up in the crowd, and an older woman named Mrs. Jefferson, who lived on the first floor, stood up. "With all due respect, honey, we've heard promises before. Mr. Walters said he was going to fix things for years, but nothing ever changed. What makes this different?" Jasmine nodded, understanding the concern. "I hear you, Mrs. Jefferson, and I can't blame anyone here for being skeptical. But this time, it's different. Because I'm not just some landlord looking to make a quick buck. I live here. My son and I call this place home. And I'm invested in making it a better place for all of us. That's why I've brought in a new property management team, and we're going to address the issues in this building right away. The repairs are already scheduled to begin next week." A few people raised their eyebrows at that. Immediate action was something they weren't used to. "I've also gone through the maintenance requests that were ignored for so long," Jasmine continued, "and we're prioritizing the ones that affect your daily lives the most, like the plumbing, the heating, and the electrical systems. We'll also be improving the safety and security of the building with new locks and better lighting in the hallways." The murmurs grew louder, and Jasmine could tell that her words were beginning to have an impact. She saw the faces of the tenants slowly shift from doubt to hope, and it gave her the strength to keep going. "There's one more thing," she added. "I know many of you have been struggling financially, especially with how things have been lately. I've been there myself, trying to make ends meet. That's why I'm reducing rent for the families who need it the most. It won't be forever, but it's something to help us all get back on our feet." This announcement sent a ripple of astonishment through the crowd. Rent reductions were unheard of, especially in the city where housing prices seemed to climb every year. Jasmine saw people whispering to each other, some visibly emotional. For the first time in a long time, they felt like they were being heard, like someone genuinely cared about their well-being. Mrs. Jefferson stood up again, this time with a smile on her face. "Well, I'll be damned. You're the real deal, aren't you?" Jasmine laughed softly, feeling a rush of relief. "I'm trying," she replied, her voice full of sincerity. Over the next few days, Jasmine made good on her promises. The repairs started, and workers filled the building, fixing leaks, replacing broken windows, and restoring the heat to apartments that had gone cold in the winter months. The new property management team worked efficiently, keeping tenants informed about the progress and listening to their concerns. One of the first things Jasmine did was have a mural painted in the courtyard, a bright, colorful piece of art that depicted unity, strength, and hope. She wanted the building to reflect the changes she was making, to give the tenants a visual representation of the new chapter they were entering together. Every time she walked by the mural, she was reminded of why she had fought so hard to make this happen. For her son, for herself, and for the entire community. The energy in the building shifted over the next few weeks. People who had once been resigned to neglect now walked with a sense of pride. Neighbors who rarely spoke to one another began striking up conversations, sharing their excitement about the improvements and their appreciation for Jasmine's efforts. Even Elijah, who had sensed his mother's earlier stress, seemed happier and more at ease. Jasmine often took walks through the building, stopping to chat with tenants and ask if there was anything more that could be done to make their lives easier. She made it a point to be visible, to let people know that she was not just a distant landlord sitting in an office somewhere. She was their neighbor, their advocate. It wasn't long before word spread beyond the building. Other landlords in the area took notice of the improvements, and people began talking about the woman who had not only bought the building she lived in, but had transformed it into a better place for everyone. Jasmine's story became a source of inspiration, not just for her tenants, but for others facing similar challenges. And yet, despite all the positive changes, Jasmine never let herself become complacent. There was always more to be done, more people to help, and more ways to improve the building. But for the first time in a long time, she felt truly hopeful about the future. She had taken a situation that could have broken her and turned it into an opportunity for growth and empowerment. And as she walked through the courtyard one evening, watching Elijah play with the other children in front of the mural, she smiled to herself. This building wasn't just brick and mortar. It was a symbol of resilience, of community, and of the incredible things that could happen when someone took a stand for what was right. Jasmine had turned her storm into a rebirth, for herself and for everyone around her. The transformation of the building was more than just a physical renovation. It was the beginning of something much bigger. What had started as a fight for her own home had evolved into a deeper mission for Jasmine, to create a community where people could live with dignity, respect, and hope. And that mission was unfolding right in front of her eyes. Weeks turned into months, and soon, the building was almost unrecognizable. The once faded paint on the walls was now vibrant and fresh. The leaky faucets were repaired, and the faulty heating system had been replaced with a modern one that ensured every apartment stayed warm throughout the winter. Jasmine's efforts had paid off in ways she had never imagined, and the tenants, many of whom had been skeptical at first, were now fully on board with the changes. The atmosphere in the building had shifted dramatically. It wasn't just the new paint or the functioning amenities. It was the sense of pride and ownership that the tenants now felt. Jasmine had empowered them, not just by improving their living conditions, but by giving them a voice. She held regular tenant meetings where everyone could discuss their concerns and ideas for further improvements. No one felt ignored anymore, and that simple shift had made all the difference. One day, while walking through the newly refurbished hallways, Jasmine bumped into Mrs. Jefferson, the elderly woman who had initially been skeptical of her plans. Mrs. Jefferson smiled warmly as they passed each other. "You've done good, Jasmine," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "I've lived in this building for 20 years, and I've never seen it like this. You've given us all a fresh start." Jasmine smiled back, touched by the words. "Thank you, Mrs. Jefferson. But it's not just me. This is all of us, our community." Mrs. Jefferson nodded knowingly, then added with a wink, "You know, I always thought you had something special in you. Took me a little while to see it, but now I know." As the months passed, the building had truly become a community, something it had never been under Mr. Walters' neglectful management. Neighbors who had once barely exchanged more than a nod in the hallway were now sharing meals, watching each other's children, and helping each other out in times of need. Jasmine had created more than just a better place to live. She had fostered a sense of belonging that had been missing for years. But Jasmine wasn't done yet. With the success of her building, she started thinking about how she could do more. She had the financial means, the knowledge, and now the confidence to take on bigger projects. The idea of expanding her efforts to other neglected buildings in the neighborhood began to take root in her mind. Why stop with just this one? There were plenty of other tenants in the area living under similar conditions, and Jasmine knew she could make a difference. She sat down with her financial advisor, Thomas Marks, to discuss the possibilities. Thomas had been instrumental in helping her buy the building, and he was just as excited about what she had accomplished. "Jasmine, what you've done here is incredible," Thomas said during one of their meetings. "Most people would have used the money to buy a new house and move on, but you stayed and fought for this community. If you're thinking about expanding, I think it's a great idea." Jasmine nodded, her mind buzzing with possibilities. "I don't just want to buy buildings, though," she said thoughtfully. "I want to change the way people live. I want to help others who've been in my position, people who've been mistreated by landlords, ignored, and made to feel powerless." Thomas leaned back in his chair, impressed. "You're talking about something much bigger than real estate." "I am," Jasmine replied, a spark of excitement in her eyes. I want to create homes, not just buildings. I want to empower people the way I've been empowered. It's not just about owning property, it's about building communities where people feel safe, respected, and valued. Thomas smiled. I think you're onto something, and I think you can do it. And so Jasmine began to lay the groundwork for her next venture. She started researching other properties in the neighborhood, looking for buildings that had been neglected or mismanaged. With each new possibility, she envisioned how she could bring the same sense of renewal and community that she had fostered in her own building. Her plan wasn't just about flipping properties for profit, it was about creating long-term, sustainable change for the people who lived there. But her journey wasn't without challenges. Some landlords were resistant to selling, and others saw her as a threat, viewing her success as an indictment of their own failures. But Jasmine didn't let the obstacles discourage her. She had faced adversity before, and she had learned that the key to overcoming it was persistence and belief in her mission. Her biggest support, as always, was Elijah. Watching her son grow and thrive in the new environment she had created for him was Jasmine's greatest source of motivation. Elijah had made new friends in the building, and every day after school he played with the other children in the courtyard, under the colorful mural that had become the heart of their community. Jasmine often watched from the sidelines, filled with a deep sense of pride and gratitude. She had done this for him, for them. One evening, after a long day of meetings and planning for her next project, Jasmine sat down with Elijah at the kitchen table. He was working on a school project, carefully cutting out pieces of construction paper for a collage. "Mama," he said, looking up from his work, "are you going to buy more buildings?" Jasmine smiled at his question. Elijah had been her biggest cheerleader throughout the whole process, even if he didn't fully understand what she was doing. "Maybe," she replied, ruffling his hair. "Why do you ask?" Elijah shrugged, glancing out the window toward the courtyard. "I think it's cool. You're helping people." Jasmine's heart swelled with pride. "That's the goal, buddy. I want to help as many people as I can." Elijah smiled, his eyes bright with admiration. "I want to help people too when I grow up." Jasmine's smile widened. "You already help me every day, Elijah, just by being you." As the evening sun cast a warm glow through the apartment, Jasmine felt an overwhelming sense of peace. She had fought for her home, for her son, and for the people around her. And in doing so, she had discovered her true purpose. She wasn't just a tenant anymore. She wasn't just a single mother struggling to make ends meet. She was a leader, a change maker, and a beacon of hope for others who were still fighting their own battles. The future stretched out before her, full of possibilities she had never dreamed of when she first received that eviction notice. What had started as a moment of fear and uncertainty had transformed into a journey of empowerment, not just for her, but for an entire community. Jasmine looked out at the courtyard, where the mural she had commissioned stood as a symbol of their rebirth. It was more than just art on a wall. It was a testament to the power of resilience, the strength of community, and the beauty of hope. This was just the beginning. As she sat there, watching Elijah work on his project, Jasmine couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for everything that had led her to this moment. The struggles, the setbacks, and the victories. They had all shaped her into the person she was today. A woman who had taken control of her destiny and in doing so had changed the lives of others. Jasmine knew that there were still challenges ahead, but she was ready for them. She had faced storms before and had come out stronger each time. And now, with the future open wide in front of her, she was ready to build something even greater. Something lasting, something meaningful. The building had been reborn, and so had Jasmine, and this was just the beginning of her new chapter. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.